Good evening. I'd like to call our special council meeting on Tuesday, March 11th to order at 6 p.m. Good evening to all in attendance, colleagues, members of staff, and members of the public. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the town of Sydney is within the territory of the Wasanich people, and we respectfully acknowledge the Sayot Nation, the Sartlam Nation, the Pakwachin Nation, the Sycam Nation, and the Malahat Nation. I would look for approval of our agenda, please. Moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor Novick. Any changes to the agenda? Not seeing any. All in favor? None are opposed. That carries. We're next turning to public participation opportunities, and where we provide opportunity for members of the public to address council. We ask that you would speak up to 4 minutes and provide your name and the municipality that you reside in. And so I'll call for a first time if anyone's wishing to come forward this evening. I'll call for a second time and a third time. Not seeing anyone come forward, I'll close public participation. And we're turning to our main business this evening under 5A, the 2025 to 2029 financial plan. And I'll turn to Mr. Hissick, our Director of Finance and Chief Financial Officer, to take us through that this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. We are here for the third of our usual three-stage budget process. I will start with a very brief recap of where we stand, remind everyone of the tax impacts, the few changes we've made since introduction, and then I propose that we would move on to final consideration of the budget by the different areas that we're familiar with, including the ones that we didn't get to last time. So the budget was introduced on February 3rd. Council had 3 weeks to go over the materials, and we met again on the 24th for initial budget deliberations, and that was the first opportunity for Council to ask questions, to delve into the budget, and to recommend changes. We are at the third meeting stage, and there is an updated presentation for Council's benefit as well as the public who might be watching tonight or on the recording. The direction from the previous meeting has been incorporated into tonight's deliberations, and the goal for the third meeting is usually to approve the financial plan as amended. If additional meetings are required, however, those can be scheduled depending on what Council would like to do in terms of extra information. So as we all know by now, the draft financial plan started out with a higher increase than we're used to. It started off at 12.85%, and that included several new budget items that were included either as supplementals or capital items, and these were subject to Council approval. At the February 24th meeting, Council reduced the impact slightly to 12.28%. And as we complete this next phase of the budget review, there are more opportunities to consider changes. A quick recap of the changes from the previous meeting. There were 3 supplemental items that were identified for alternate funding. So a couple of the Rose Garden projects as well as the Resthaven Tennis Court were funded from the amenity reserve instead of taxation. 2 of the supplementals were rejected outright, and 1 capital project was deferred to 2026. Those 6 changes brought the impact down by about 0.5% to 12.28, which saves the average taxpayer about $10 a year. An updated impact on the tax bill shows that we are now down to an annual impact of $220 or about $18.30 per month. And this was covered last meeting, but I think it's really valuable to explain why we're here. So if you'll indulge me, I would like to go over it one more time. So we are here because of a situation that's 5 years in the making. It's down to the fact that when the pandemic hit in 2020, We revisited the budget and we rolled back the previously approved tax increase, and we also reduced commercial taxes by 10%. So tax reductions due to COVID were one factor. Another one related to the pandemic is extraordinarily high inflation that's been caused by supply chain issues that still have not normalized since the pandemic. In addition to that, another big impact has been the ongoing need to increase services, especially in the protective services area, being RCMP and fire first responder. Finally, the Canada-BC Safe Restart Grant was a blessing and a curse for us. It really saved our bacon back in 2020. It allowed us to replenish some lost revenues, but on the flip side, it gave us the luxury of deferring the much needed tax increases that we knew were coming. So going back to 2020, we reduced our property tax revenues by a total of $576,000 between those two changes I just mentioned. And while we reduced our revenues, the expenditure levels stayed at normal, and those were required to fund services. We knew at that time that we'd have to make up that lost tax revenue over time, and at that time we were expecting that we'd have to start making it up the following year, so in 2021. And then we got the Safe Restart Grant, which was a welcome one-time allocation from the federal and provincial governments that allowed us to stretch out our phase back and make up for the lost revenues in year one. The cumulative Safe Restart funds that we used over the last 5 years to make up for lost tax revenues were $2.1 million, which equates to a tax impact of 15.3%. So one could say that we've deferred 15.3% in increases, and that's a big part of the reason why we came in at 12.85% today. So even though our revenues stayed relatively stable, our expenditure levels kept increasing to fund existing and new services. So when I say existing, I'm largely talking about the inflation, the fact that it cost us more to deliver the same level of service because of just general price increases impacting the construction industry, which is more relevant to us than general CPI. When I talk about new services, I talk about internal and external demands on additional funding, whether it was to fund our own incremental service level increases or to fund an external organization like the Shaw Centre. So each year we require some new tax revenue growth to keep up with our increasing costs. And every time we fund that requirement with something other than taxes, we're contributing to a deferred tax increase. And eventually those deferred taxes have to be made up. That's where we find ourselves now. So on the revenue side, instead of increasing taxes, we use what we call tax mitigation. So we used growing amounts of our accumulated surplus, and we use that Safe Restart Grant over 5 years to keep us from having to increase taxes. So this shows in tabular form what we've done over the last 5 years. In 2020, we needed to come up with $677,000 in taxes to make up for not only the budget increase, but the tax cuts that we made in that pandemic year. So we used Safe Restart funding and additional surplus instead of taxation, but the required tax increase to make up that number would have been 5.66%. Moving on to 2021, once again we use Safe Restart and additional surplus instead of taxation, and that year it was equivalent to over 10%. And the story continues through 2022, 23, and 2024. So we kept our taxes down while we kept having to pay for more expensive services and adding service levels that we've already talked about. So we looked at this last time, a bit of a what-if scenario. What if we had added a 3% tax increase every year from 2021 through 2024, rather than keeping it all for the end? What it would have done is, in 2021, we had a tax increase of 2.7%, rather than 5.7%, which would have helped with phasing back to normal revenues. But in all fairness, in 2021, we were still worried about the impacts on the community of the pandemic, and we were loath to increase taxes any more than we needed to. The same could be said in 2022. There were still concerns about the future, so we kept the tax increase relatively low, instead of, once again, adding that little 3% bump to gradually bring us back to where we needed to be. And so on and so on. But you see, by adding that 3% a year, by 2023 and 2024, we would have been in fairly uncomfortable territory in terms of tax increases. As it was, we ended up slightly higher than we're traditionally used to because of inflation pressures. But they could have been even higher if we had phased this in over time instead of leaving it all to the end. So that's where we find ourselves. Had we done that 3% lift over the 4 years, we would have come in this year at a 7.44% increase instead of 12.85%. Still substantial, but far less so. So we looked at this last time as well. What are the most likely sources to reduce the tax impact? It would be capital projects that we fund from taxation. It would be tax-funded supplementals, which we did attack last time. Traditionally, we could look to reduce transfers to reserve, but as of this year, there really aren't any discretionary transfers left to reduce. If we reduced any of the ones we still have, we would compromise our ability to fund capital through non-tax means in future years. Normally we have the use of surplus, but as we know by now, our surplus level is below minimum policy levels, and while we're continuing to use it for the next 2 years to keep tax increases to a minimum, we know that after these 2 years, we're going to have to develop a plan to replenish that surplus level. Quick reminder, each 1% reduction in taxes equates to about $148,000 in services, and it has an annual impact on the taxpayer of $18. So if we reduce it by another 2%, it'll save the average household $36, and we have to weigh that savings against the impact to service levels and future financial sustainability. That $18 equates to $1.49 a month, so 2% would be $3 a month. A quick look at our 5-year projection. We see that year 1 is a fairly hefty increase. Year 2, we're looking at higher than average, but not nearly as substantial as this year. And then things should normalize a bit in the following 3 years, but please note, those numbers do not include an amount to replenish our surplus, which we have a certain level of discretion on how quickly we do that and how much we impact each of the years 3 to 5 of this current financial plan. Another note on this is the more we reduce taxes in year 1, the starting point, the more challenging our task will be in year 2, because our base level of taxes will be lower, therefore the percentage increase will have to be higher in 2026 to make up for it. In terms of items requiring review, at the previous meeting we got through supplemental requests and we got through the tax-funded capital. However, if Council wishes to revisit either of those, we may choose to do so. Otherwise, the areas we didn't cover are non-tax funded capital, general operations, and the utility budgets. And as we go through these, I would ask that Council approve any budget changes by resolution. So overall tonight, what we have to hopefully do is approve each and every subset of the budget, so the operating, the capital, and then the water and sewer. And subject to tonight's review, I see the following 4 resolutions being required at some point once we're finished deliberating on those sections. So we would first make any additions, deletions, and changes to the budget by resolution. Once we're done with the general operating, including supplementals, a motion to approve the general operating budget as amended would be in order. And then we can move on to capital, water, and sewer. The supplemental requests broken down into one-time and ongoing, these are the changes that were considered at the last meeting. So you see that there were 2 items that are crossed off this list that were not approved, and they're out of the budget now. There are 3 further items that were funded by non-tax means, and those have been reduced here. And then moving on to the ongoing, there was 1 item there that was not approved, and that's been taken out of the budget. So unless council would like to revisit any supplemental items, I would suggest we move on to capital.
Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. And through speaking with the corporate officer, I'm going to move that we rescind the removal of review of library services for $20,000. And if I get a seconder, I'll explain the rationale.
I'll second.
Second for discussion.
Go ahead, Councillor Garnett.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a reconsideration on this. We have a letter on our agenda from Mr. Wainwright, and I think that information is somewhat new and it wasn't not part of the discussion when we removed this item. And also, Councillor Novak was not present at that meeting. And as the trustee for us at the Vancouver Island Regional Library, I think it would be important to have his input in the discussions as well before we make a final decision.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rintoul. I'll comment briefly in that I'm supportive of reconsideration, in part because this was defeated in a 3-3 tie with the absence of 1 council member. But like the individual who corresponded with council with his long-time experience on council, I think after 20 to 25 years, a review of library service is overdue. And that it is prudent to do it. It was noted in previous discussion that we haven't had recently, we did last term, but we haven't had recently requests for the members of the public to do so. But I don't think that's necessary. There are many things that we review at the town of Sydney that are, quite frankly, prudent, are part of our fiscal and governance responsibilities to do, and I feel that we should, particularly given that we have worked for the past 4 or 5 years to have alignment with North Saanich. We understand that this is a shared service between Sydney and North Saanich, and that's North Saanich at this time does have it as a strategic priority and within their budget, and that it aligns, it finally aligns for us to do this review together. I'll turn to other colleagues if there are comments. Councillor Novak.
I'll just comment briefly on it. My instinct as a trustee of VRL would be to say, let's leave it as is and not bother with a review. However, as a councillor who is, trying to use our dollars prudently, if in fact we haven't done a formal review in the length of time that was stated, I think Mayor said 20 odd years, I think it's probably worth looking at. I'm confident that VRL does offer very good bang for the buck. I think it's a large operation, and its administrative costs are defrayed over 38 libraries around the island and Sunshine Coast, or the coast rather. And so I'm not convinced that we could do better with GVPL. That being said, I think it stands to reason that we should have this looked at by an impartial party. My question, perhaps through you to staff, would be, is that $20,000, I think it's $20,000 on the budget, is that the total cost of the professional review, or is that simply our portion of the cost of a professional review shared with North Saanich?
Mr. Hisek, please.
That is our estimated portion, although we really don't have much of a handle on how much such a review costs. It's our best estimate at this point, and North Saanich is budgeting independently.
I'm sorry.
If it were cost shared, we would be showing our net cost here.
Okay, so you're saying North Saanich is budgeting the same amount and sort of a catch-all that'll
Yes.
hopefully cover whatever professional fees we would incur, and in all likelihood it would turn out to be less because we tend to over-budget things.
Sorry,
So for,
Councillor Novak, I'm going to interject for a moment. The comment "we tend to over budget" I don't think is appropriate.
I shouldn't have said, I should say we build in buffers in our budget. We build in
Well,
allowances.
I'm not sure I would sustain that comment.
Anyway,
However,
anyway, that being said, I'll support this. I'll support this motion for those reasons.
thank you. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Question through you, through staff. My recollection is, did we get some information from North Saanich recently in terms of whether, what their feelings were about proceeding with this year? Or I understood that they might be inclined to defer this till next year or some other time.
Turn to Mr. Hisek.
My understanding is that they will follow our lead.
Okay.
So the reason we had it in this year's budget is because a change in provider requires a referendum, and we think the best time to do that would be concurrent with an election to save money. So if we miss this window, we would have to have a standalone referendum or wait until 2030.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor, you still have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. I'm still inclined to let this one go for this year. As I said before, there's nobody clamoring to say that they're unhappy with our library services. Things seem to be running well. If there were a lot of concerns, I'd be more inclined. And at a time when there's lots of things that we're not able to afford, this seems like something that it would be a nice thing to do, but I don't think it's critical at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to add to, if there's no other first-time speakers, just add to Mr. Hisek's point that a review of library service, if the councils were to move forward with it, would require a referendum, and the best timing, particularly for the significant cost impact, would be to align it, which would not result in a significant cost impact with the 2026 election. And that if we didn't do that, it would be moved forward. Perhaps it would be up to the next councils, both in Sydney and North Saanich, to bring forward. But again, the best timing would be a referendum in 2030. That's 6 years out, unless you wanted to incur substantial costs for a referendum midterm. So I think, for the sake of $20,000 as our portion, versus moving this quite substantially down the road is worthy of consideration now. Not seeing further discussion, I'll just clarify with Ms. Nelson, our corporate officer, that given we are reconsidering this motion, the motion was to remove the $20,000 from the budget. So we're actually calling the question on that motion. So if you're in favor of Councillor, or
Just to clarify,
Ms.
that
Nelson.
wasn't a reconsideration of a motion, that was to rescind a motion. So
or
there's a
to rescind the
difference,
motion, my apologies. So voting in favor of rescinding the motion would add the $20,000 back into the budget. So are you in favor of rescinding the motion and the $20,000 going back into the budget? I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor O'Keefe, Councillor Rentoul, Councillor Duncan, and Councillor Duck are opposed. The motion is defeated. Councillor Garnett, you did have the floor. That's one item. So we are, the previous slide to this, or sorry, this is the one-time requests, and the next slide is ongoing requests. Do council members have any further considerations on one-time or ongoing requests on those two slides? If we can maybe just go to the second slide for a moment, thank you. Mr. Hissick.
I should have introduced the fact that in the staff report on the agenda, I did introduce a couple of additional items that staff might put forward for potential reductions. And one of those is on this list in the one-time requests. The demolishing the 3rd Street Park buildings. While there is some risk to deferring it to next year, it wouldn't, I think we can manage it. So that is one area that we might look to perhaps defer.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. And a question through to staff. We did have some discussion on this, and staff did consider, Mr. Hissick is provided some information, but if council voted to defer this cost to next year, would staff still look at one or more of those other options that council had considered in the interim? Mr.
Yes,
Edwards?
this would give us more time to look into those details, yes.
Okay.
Because, frankly, 2 weeks is a little tight.
No, certainly, but we appreciate that. Thank you for the reply. I'll turn to colleagues if there's any further consideration of this. Councillor O'Keefe?
Sure. I'll move that we defer the $40,000 for demolishing the building at 3rd Street Park.
We have it seconded. I'll turn to the movers.
I think it's a good suggestion from staff. Gives us some time to look at other opportunities. It's helps us bring things down a bit, so that's all I have.
Councillor Duncan? Nothing further. Councillor Rintoul? Sorry, I'm seeing one hand first because you're on either side of me.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate staff having taken a look at this and brought the suggestion forward. I haven't been by recently to see the state of these buildings, and so perhaps through the mayor to staff. You're obviously comfortable in deferring this for a year. The prospect, in my mind at least, of what could well become quickly dilapidated building and perhaps a risk in other manners would be a concern to me. So I just asked staff to address those potential concerns, please.
Through the chair to Councillor Rintoul, we're in the park pretty much weekly just to keep an eye, to walk the perimeter to make sure everything is okay. We walk through the building about once a month. We're not seeing any huge degradations of everything. I think we'd be quite fine to leave it for another year for sure. That'll give us an idea. Again, looking at the ongoing supplemental requests we had for the maintenance of the park, that will bear us a little bit of time to actually see what our actual costs are on that as well to maintain the footprint. So there may be some adjustments we can make with that as well at that time.
Thanks, Mr. Robinson.
So thank you. I appreciate the insight that staff are there on a fairly regular basis. Maybe I watch too much television. I'm just concerned about dilapidated buildings being unoccupied and the potential for risks that could come with that. So at this point, I'm not inclined to support the motion, but I'll yield to hear my colleagues' further comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Garnett?
Thank you, Mayor. And I realize I was the one that brought forward the recycling aspect of it, but I won't support the motion, and it's for a different reason. I'm not in favor of deferring tax funded at this point in time, because this is going to have to be done and we're pushing costs down the road. And I have real concerns about that, and staff, Mr. Hissick has spoken eloquently to the fact that we're not going to be dealing with surplus next year, but the next council will have to deal with the surplus issue. And I want to afford them the latitude to be able to do that without having high tax increases from things we've deferred forward, and give them the chance to be able to address the surplus shortage And in my opinion, the reserve shortages, which I'm not comfortable with myself, I think we've gotten too low in some areas. And so I'm concerned that by doing things like this to try and lower the number, we're having unintended consequences, because this is a 5-year financial plan. As much as we want to get this number down as low as we can for our residents, we need to view it as a 5-year plan. And every decision we make tonight like this has an impact in years 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the ability to address what could be critical reserves and surplus that this community is going to need to be financially stable in the future. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Duck.
Yes, if I may, Mayor, through to staff. If we leave this fund in here, it's not like it's going to be torn down right away. You'll still go through the same process of looking at how to consider other demolition methods that may be less expensive, and also looking at how it's managed. So it's not, to staff's point, that it's, it's not going to be done in the next 2 weeks. It could be done 6, 9, 10, 12 months down the road. Is that what we're understanding? And so if we leave the money there, it's not necessarily going to be used right now. It's still going to be looked at as to how to be done best.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a tendency not to, like Councillor Garnett, not to want to push things down the road, especially something that we have decided needs to be done. Pushing it down the road is a false economy. There is a strong likelihood that that $40,000 could turn into a bigger number a year from now. There's also the possibility that there may be inherent costs in maintaining that building for another year should something unforeseen happen. These are all unknowns, of course, at this time, but we know that we need to demolish the building at some point in time, and so my feeling is that if we have a good idea that the cost target is $40,000, we should use that and get it done as soon as possible, rather than taking a chance, pushing it down the road, and watching the 40,000 balloon into 50,000 perhaps, and maybe some attendant costs in keeping the building free of vermin or who knows what. So I'm not in favor of, or rather, now I can't remember what the motion was. I know it was to keep the demolition going, so I'm definitely for that.
The motion on the floor is to remove the $40,000, or to defer the $40,000
So I'm
to 2026.
I'm not in favor of deferring that money. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Novak. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. For me, I think what's important here is we know that that building is going to have to come down, but staff have indicated that it's not likely to get done in the short term, and there's some other options that could be investigated. And so that's why I'm okay with, putting it, deferring it to next year, because I think it's going to be, that'll be when we would get to it anyways, and also that it gives them that additional time to look at whether we might recycle or somehow reduce the cost. So that's where I see this is a little bit different in terms of other items. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I have a question through to staff. The acquisition of this park was based on a recognition that we have a growing community, and that we don't have a park in that part of our community. The Growing Communities Fund was intended to address, growth in a community, and this could be tied to that. I appreciate that the Growing Communities Fund is not replenished, and that we are using a sizable portion. We're using just over half of the beginning balance this year, just over half of the 1.2 million. We're using almost 700,000 actually, and it leaves a balance of 536. Is there a particular reason staff did not consider, or did staff consider the Growing Communities Fund with this
Thank you, Mr.
particular?
Mayor. I did consider it, and for 2 reasons I didn't recommend it, but that's not to say a case can't be made for it. generally, it's to support adding things, not taking away, but the argument could be made that it's part of the parkland purchase and readying the parkland for its intended use. So on that basis, yes, I could make a straight-face argument that this is a good use of the GCF. The other reason I didn't is because the balance is diminishing and it's largely allocated for other things, and there's a very small balance left at the end of next year as it stands. But if council saw fit, that would be one alternative to removing it entirely.
Thank you for the answer. So that's a consideration for council. I'm not seeing any further discussion at this point. So I'll look to call the question on deferring this until 2026. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novick, Councillor O'Toole, Councillor Burnett, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Duck. The motion is defeated. Any other items, Councillor Keefe?
Thank you. I'll move that we fund the demolition of the 3rd Street building from the Growing Communities Fund.
Second.
I'm not sure if we need any motivation, but I'll turn to you.
I think staff have said that there's a reasonable case to be made for that, so I don't think there's anything to add.
Thank you. Not seeing any further discussion. I'll call the question. All in favor? That carries unanimous. Thank you. And again, turning for one more time, or as many times as necessary, to council. Are there any other items on either of these two slides wish to address? Mr. Hisek.
Just to bring your attention to the other supplemental item that staff discussed in the report, which is reducing the amount of funding for storm drain repairs, which is an ongoing supplemental item that was to begin this year. So we would still look for full budget amounts in future years, but given that we're partway through this year already, if we reduced it by $37,500 to a new amount of $50,000 for 2025, it's a figure we could work with.
Okay, so thank you for that. We do see the additional storm drains repair line about 6 items down in the purple, if my eyes are working, 87.5, which would be reduced. Councillor O'Toole?
Thank you. I'll move that the additional storm drain repairs line be reduced by $37,500.
Do we have a seconder?
I'll second for discussion.
Councillor Keefe, we'll turn to the movers.
No, staff spoke to it. It's in the report. I support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Councillor Duncan? Sorry, Councillor Keefe is the seconder.
Actually, I just had a question through you to staff. In regards to storm drain repairs, I got the sense in reading the eligibility in the Canada Community Building Fund that maintenance and repairs for storm drains could be used, and so I'm wondering if this entire amount might be funded out of the Canada Community Building Fund. I don't think it falls under the Growing Community Fund, but
I don't think
seems-
I'm sorry,
Okay.
please finish.
No, so I just wondering if it fit in either of those.
I don't believe it fits in the CCBF because it is intended for capital. When they talk about maintenance, it's meant for major maintenance that extends the life, and this doesn't really quite fall into that. We are doing our best to use the community building fund for capital items. And again, that's another oversubscribed reserve of ours. If we allocate that to this particular initiative, if it were eligible, then we're taking it away from something else, and you can only spend it once.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Just while we've spoken about the growing communities, the Canada Community Building Fund, we see the contribution of $625,000 that does come from the federal government. What is the length of the agreement that the federal government has for that that level of contribution continuing?
It was recently renewed for, I believe, a 10-year period.
Thank you. Seeing no further Councillor Duncan?
Yeah, thank you. I was just gonna say, I was opposed to this one simply because, though staff has identified it as potentially being something we could defer, I see that as the most likely potential for overage due to additional storms and climate change impacts. And I just know what the one that hit during the provincial election tore up a fair amount of the waterfront infrastructure. And I don't know how many storm drains were affected there, but I think that there's a good chance that there will be more winter storms that do affect it. And I'd hate to not have put the money into this that we knew would potentially be needed based on previous events. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else for a first time? I'll turn back to Councillor O'Keefe for a second time.
Thank you. Actually, Councillor Duncan made me think about, yes, storm drains and climate action. And we still have money in our climate action fund. Is this question through you to staff, is something like additional storm drain repairs, something that could be taken from the climate action fund?
Sorry, I'll just note, Councillor O'Keefe, that the Climate Action Fund has a starting balance of 147,000. We're using 69,000 already, which leaves 78. So there isn't enough in the fund to fund the full amount of this item.
Yeah, well, part of it, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. I'll turn to Mr. Isaac.
You might be referring to the annual local government climate action grant that we get from the province. But in either case, we really don't see this item as climate related.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards, please.
Yeah, if I just might add, the intention of that fund is to fund climate mitigation ideally, and adaptation is eligible, but this is really a maintenance issue and not upsizing for, like, you know, a higher level magnitude event.
Thank you. Any further discussion? So we're voting on reducing it by 37.5. I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duncan is opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. Okay, thank you to staff, to Mr. Hissick for bringing those items forward in the staff report, and to council for considering those. I believe we are done now on both the one-time and the ongoing supplemental requests.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If council chose, you may make a motion to approve the supplemental items as amended, or leave it for one large motion with the general operating budget. It's your choice. One way to draw a line under this.
I think my suggestion to colleagues is that we leave it for the broader motion of supporting the operating budget as amended when that time comes. Thank you.
Okay. Moving on to the capital budget. At the last meeting, we did get through the tax-funded capital. However, this is, before we move on to the other components of the capital budget, this is a chance for council to revisit any of those items, including the two identified in the staff report for potential reductions.
Mr. Hissick, could you perhaps take us those, make reference to those two in the staff report
Sure.
to get us started?
Actually, there are three that are recommended for potential reconsideration. One being the Glass Beach safety improvements, which, while they are worthwhile, there is no reason it can't occur in 2026. That's a $20,000 item. There's we have an annual budget for replacing our survey monuments, so we set aside $10,000 a year, accumulate a certain amount, and then we buy X number of these monuments. And please don't ask me what they are. We've got experts in the room who can tell you. But deferring that contribution for 1 year is not going to impact our overall position in that accumulation. And finally, the reducing workspace efficiency item, which is made up of three components. We've looked at the three components, and we've identified one of the three being the modular furniture for one of our meeting rooms as being the least critical, and it could be deferred until next year. That would save a further $5,500.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. So, council, we could consider the three items together or one at a time as you may wish. Councillor Gurnett?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll move that the survey monument replacement for $10,000 be cancelled for 2025.
Sorry, would it be appropriate, Mr. Hissick, for that to be deferral? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, what was the motion?
Just reading it from your staff report to cancel it for 2025.
I will take that as a deferral.
Second.
We haven't moved and seconded to, Mr. Hissick?
I'm sorry, I really am with it. I'm just caught off guard with that one. Canceling it for 2025 is all that's required because it's an annual program. It'll be reinstated next year anyway.
Okay. We appreciate staff's consideration when drafting the report for council. Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff, this, because it's an annual program, it's not new. Have we successfully sort of kept pace with replacing and maintaining survey monuments throughout the community?
Through the mayor to Councillor Rintoul. We haven't as yet. The process for replacing monuments is quite onerous. It goes through the province. So we have to maintain a certain network of monuments for the community. And the province has some regulations that they won't accept because they sort of manage them in the end. There's a minimum number that they'll accept for a reinstatement at one point. So we haven't done a program as yet, but we're building that fund. So at the time when we do go to that program, we have that funds in place.
Ms. Clary?
And just further to that, the town as well has good coverage as far as survey monuments go right now, so we don't need to do this program, but the intent of this is to build up enough funds so that when we do need to install more, we have enough funding there available.
Thank you.
Thank you. A question through to staff, and thank you, Mr. Demare. Do we have an idea of how many of these monuments, monuments sound important, or how many there are in the community, or?
Rough estimate, there's probably 120. There's quite a few.
Okay, so we're looking at a fraction of that is new ones going in the future? Or?
Yeah, the intent is as if they get disturbed through construction activities or damage in any way to replace them. So it's not necessarily replacing or adding new ones, but it's to replace ones that we do have that get damaged over time to time.
Great, thank you. Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff. Is this something that is going to have to be done regardless of whether it's done this year, next year, or in future years?
Through the mayor, yes, we actually have a agreement in place with the provincial government that as part of maintaining or having these monuments that we have agreed to maintain them and make sure we have a set number or a networking of monuments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novick is opposed. The motion carries. Does council wish to consider either of the other two items? Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. I'm not thinking of those two items, but I just have a question through you to staff about the fire department equipment, 14,760. I'm not proposing that we take that out. I presume that it's a really important thing. But what I'm wondering is, I'm kind of skipping ahead a bit to, if we were to cancel the CSB training area project, my recollection is that there was $54,000 that was carried forward from last year, I believe, from forest, the town's contribution to fighting forest fires. And I'm wondering, would that 54,000 be eligible to apply to the fire department equipment? I know that we kind of like to, because it's the firefighters that are earning that, that we'd like to kind of put it back into them. Is that a yes?
Asked and answered. No. Generally, because as you say, it is the firefighters that earn that through their wildfire efforts. We like to keep that for things that, not the must-haves, like the protective equipment that we buy through this annual budget, but more the enhancements to their environment as opposed to the stuff that the town should be paying for, like taking care of their turnout gear or their breathing apparatus, which is what the annual budget is typically for. So could it be used? Yes.
Okay.
I'd be loath to do it, though.
Okay, I'll just hold that thought for now to see what we decide to do later on other things then. Thanks.
Thank you, Council. Okay, not seeing Council wishing to consider those other two items, so we can move forward from this slide, Mr. Isaac.
Okay, I am considering tax-funded capital to be complete at this point. So before we move ahead to other capital, I would just like to add a general comment. And it's based on, ever since the last meeting, I've been getting questions from council, and we've been working through various Q&A on various aspects of the budget. And certain themes do emerge. So I've added this slide since the agenda went out just to address some of these concerns. And it's about the magnitude of our annual capital spending. Can we have less aggressive capital plans? And the answer is yes, we can be less ambitious in our capital spending, but most of it is reserve funded. And while the tax impacts are less immediate, they are possible by canceling reserve-funded projects, because then we need fewer reserve contributions down the road in the long run. In the short term, I would say be careful about reducing contributions until we're at a level that we're all comfortable with. Having said that, many of our larger projects are based on council-endorsed plans, like the Active Transportation Plan, the West Side LAP, the Parks Master Plan, etc. So when the ATP was adopted, it's council that directed an average annual spend of $1 million on ATP projects. All we're doing is complying with that direction. Things like park improvements, they're from the Parks Master Plan. I think one of our largest capital projects this year is McDonald Park Road improvements. That was a priority in the West Sydney LAP. None of these are necessarily things that we're bringing forward. It's in response to a council-endorsed plan. Some of the larger projects can be cut back, but not without impacts. So to those plans, as well as one example would be the Kenora Road project, which is included in the budget for the next 4 years. So the paving component of that does need to be done because it's in fairly bad shape. But we don't need to add the sidewalks and the curb and gutter. That's more of a nice to have. So if council wanted to reduce the scope of that, while it's reserve funded, it might impact our long-term reserve contributions in order to pay for those kinds of things. There are really choices to be made here, but as of now, we are responding to previously approved long-term plans. Park improvements also might be cut back or deferred. But once again, we're just responding to an approved plan, and we can be less ambitious. Believe me, once these plans are put in place, and even through their development, our staff are very serious about improving the quality and level of service to the community. We believe in nicer parks. We believe in more active transportation infrastructure, and we bring that forward as directed. So if you want us to be less ambitious, that's fine. It'll just require a bit of a rethink on plans we've already approved, and we're more than ready to do that. So moving on, we've looked at the tax-funded capital. The remainder of the capital that we have to consider, there are plenty of 2025 projects that are not tax funded. They're funded from reserves and other sources. And we have a long list of projects in the binders. Beyond 2025, we have future years capital. We don't have to necessarily tackle those tonight, but the option is open for council. And with that, I would open it to any questions or proposed changes.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. I'm just turning to the middle bullet in terms of 2026 to 2029 capital. And while it's optional for council to consider them at this time, versus we know they will come forward to us in the respective years in the 5-year plan, is there a particular reason you would suggest council give consideration to a particular future project? I'm not, when I use the word future, I'm meaning 2026 to 29.
I'm not necessarily inviting council to do so. It's just you have that option should you choose to take advantage of it. So you're right, future year projects will come forward again next year, but there are some that are multi-year projects that are initiated in 2025 or even sooner. So if you don't want phase 2 to begin, now would be a good time to kill phase 1. Kenora, like I mentioned earlier, we've got 2 years of planning for that project, this year and next, and then capital construction will begin in year 3 and be completed in year 4. So if you wanted to rethink on that, now might be a good time to tell us. There are certain projects where through a typical year, if it's slated for year 2 and we'd like to get going on it very early in the new year, we might bring a report forward to council in the fall, let's say, asking for permission to proceed. And that would essentially give pre-approval to the 2026 capital ahead of next year's consideration. But those are few and far between. I think you can tell by looking at the 5-year capital plan and which projects are multi-phase, which ones really are worthy of consideration now and which ones can likely wait until next year's process.
Thank you. With that, I do have a question with regards to the Parks capital budget projects, Parks capital projects. And only the 2025 one, although I will make a little bit of reference to 2026. It is Appendix A in the report, colleagues will note. And that is, I'm turning back for just a moment to when the Parks Master Plan was approved at the beginning of the last term. That would have been in 2019. And I know there wasn't a definitive cost attached to all of the projects in the Parks Master Plan in the priority parks that were addressed. But I think there were ballparks of 5 million, 6 million, 7 million, if all of those improvements, and we appreciated that would occur, or those improvements would occur over the long term. My recollection that there was some discussion that staff in considering the Parks Master Plan into budget process as we are now for each year may consider a significant project in one of the parks, and certainly some of the perhaps minor improvements or maintenance that is necessary. When I look at this budget, or when I look at the budget and I see 2025, we see $150,000 for the picnic shelter replacement in Tallista Park. We see a $300,000 Rathdown Park redevelopment in 2 stages. One is the drainage, the significant drainage issue in 2025, and then going to the washrooms and I'm not sure what court it is, but it's an amenity court in 2026. But then we also have $60,000 for and lesser amounts, 20 and 20,000s and 10,000s for what would be considered some improvements like repaving and otherwise and Glass Beach safety improvements in the other parks. But could staff perhaps speak to and then we see in 2026 $250,000 for Rathdown, which will be amenity equipment and washrooms, and then $450,000 for additional elements to Breather Park. Can staff perhaps speak to that priority setting, please?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So staff have gotten together and through a series of workshops, prioritized projects that were identified in the Parks Master Plan, and then came up with a 20-year plan. So we actually have a 20-year plan, and also we trimmed it down to a 10-year plan. So these projects are based on that 20-year plan, which the intent of that was to do most things that were identified in the Parks Master Plan. Some of these items, like for example, the Tallista Picnic Shelter, was something we actually had in the 2024 budget. However, because of the archaeological sensitive area, we knew more funding was required, and so we've increased the budget for this year to still do the project. So it is ambitious, and we would definitely take feedback from council if they did not want to proceed with a program that is this ambitious, and defer some of the park improvements. So it really is based on doing most of what was identified in the Parks Master Plan over a 20-year period.
Thank you. And I'll note that, in most recent years, the significant improvements to Rathdown Park and then last year Rest Haven Park, I think not just the neighborhood, but the entire community actually appreciates and notices and appreciates, the improvements to those amenities. I think they're fairly significant in those parks. Thank you for that clarification. So, Mr. Hisik, this would be the appropriate time to consider other capital if council has any questions or wants to bring forward an item.
Now's the time.
Thank you. Councillor Duck, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I would put a motion forward that we remove the CSB public education space from the budget. It's funded through CFWD and reserves, and based on the recent memo from staff, these reserves are being tapped well, and I think if we could maintain some of the funds in.
Okay, Council, we're
Oh,
not
sorry,
gonna
I'm
ask you for the
motivating, yes,
motivate.
yep, thank you.
So the motion is to remove. Do we have a seconder? Councillor O'Keefe seconds.
second.
We'll turn back to your motivations.
Sorry. It's in,
sorry, Councillor Duck.
page 64 of the binder, about the 10 lines down, FIR 24-001, CSB Public Education Service, a space for $300,000 of budget, $54,000 from CFWD, and $246,000 from reserves. And why I'm proposing this is that I don't see a defined need for this space right now, and our reserves are, as Councillor Garnett indicated earlier, and so have staff, our reserves are under pressure right now. Given the location of the CSB, there's access to the Mary Winspear for space for public education. There's also facilities within the building already that could be utilized for public education. That public education could also be done outside under tents or somewhere. I don't see a significant enough need to put in $300,000 to finish this building as it was originally planned, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the seconder, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thanks. So I don't deny the importance of educating the public about fire safety. Of course, it's important. But I think it seems to me that it would be nice to have, but with some of the challenges we're facing, it's hard for me to justify this. The other thing is that by taking this out of this is coming from the Growing Communities Fund. So taking it out of the Growing Communities Fund opens up a good chunk of money that we could fund other capital projects from and reduce the tax impact significantly. So I'm not talking, I presume we're not talking about deferring it. We're taking it off the books completely. I think there's other options to do public education next door at Mary Winspear. So it's a nice to have, and in this climate, I think these are the sort of nice to haves that I think we need to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rintoul.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And if I may, through you, to the chief, the intent based on the project summary here was to address, an element of the original building design and construction that was removed at the time to save money, as I understand it from this, component. Could you speak to that in terms of, the functionality of the facility without this element included as was designed, number one? And number two, a little bit about the types of undertakings the space was intended for, because I heard Councillor Keith make reference to, fire safety, for example, but I'm sure there are other initiatives, be they, related to earthquake safety, things that, public education opportunities, a broad array, that likely just aren't, summarized in this project summary. So I'll yield to the chief if you can add some background, please.
I'll turn to Chief Mickelson. Good evening.
Good evening. So, through the chair to Councillor Rintoul, the building was constructed specifically as a 2.5 and 3-story building to maintain a larger footprint for training, which, if you remember the old fire hall on 3rd Street, we had essentially no room. So that was really the key goal. And after visiting a number of fire hall sites, I visited a number across North America, and the council of the day also visited a few on the lower mainland. We landed on a design that had the administration and kind of living quarters upstairs, and the public education focus / emergency management focus was on the ground floor. So that was kind of the established best practice, and that was the design rationale moving forward. You're correct. I would say right now the space is not essential. Up to this time, we've been able to probably be by far the most active department in respect to on the peninsula, in respect to public engagement and facilitating whether it be emergency management or fire related type activities, public education activities, whether in stratas, in other public buildings, the Nelhorth Room or other places. So that's all things that we can continue to do. We pursued this largely as a result of the building was not complete, and these grant funds, basically when I looked at it, they were perfectly suited for that use. So that was kind of why the pursuance of this got to this point. We do have about, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say about 35,000 in already sunk architectural costs that we would have to be absorbed, or depending on the duration that we defer or omit, would just be essentially written off. And I would also say that, at this point, it's not an essential requirement, especially when the savings, probably equates, 240 some odd thousand is probably like a 1.6% tax savings in a very kind of tough environmental climate. Is totally understandable, and I support it, but I think we need to recognize that although not essential now, as the town grows and as the need for public education, it will be, it will have to happen at some time, and the bill won't be $300,000. It'll likely be $400,000 or $500,000. So that's just in totality, that needs to be kind of factored into your decision.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's my concern with the motion, is that it's looking to strike this item, not defer it. And so I'm concerned with that. I know we're also spearheading, changes to address, water and in the event of an emergency. Some of these facilities, as the building was intended, I'm sure have multi-purpose uses that we're just not envisioning in this discussion. So I'm concerned with the motion that's before us. I'll listen to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And through you to staff, could you give us a little more, say, color commentary on what that space would or could or is planned to be used for if it is completed?
Can I just, I'm sorry to interject, but if I could just add to that, and just what is the size of the space, just in addition to Councillor Novick's question?
Yeah, this would be an approximation. I would probably say it's about 40 by 25.
It's about 1,000 square feet. Okay. And so what would you be using that space for, and do you have a plan for it, or are there certain types of activities that would go, or that space would be used for that couldn't be done elsewhere?
Yeah, so through the chair to Councillor Novak, again, as I stated, we've been doing these, whether it be upstairs or in different places, so it can always be done elsewhere. But the idea would be, number one, would be a whole multitude of tasks, setting up for Saanich Peninsula Alert, the wildfire mitigation project that we're in the midst of, and the community wildfire plan, that would be done. Community CPR type of clinics would be in there as well, not to mention basic emergency management and preparedness, training, facilitating meeting rooms for Meet Your Street, basically anything related to public fire safety, education, and emergency management would be kind of housed and focused in there on a more permanent basis versus kind of on an ad hoc basis where we quickly set up something in one of our 3 rooms that are set up by dividers and then kind of take it down. So it would just allow for a more permanent setup, which is essentially the requirement based on what we saw in other communities. And again, it's not an absolutely essential thing today, but again, the need's not going away and this will come back. So that's kind of my message to council.
Thank you.
Thank you. A follow-up question I have is, along with fire department members, volunteers, is PMO involved? And you mentioned some of the ad hoc sessions that occur. Is PMO involved in this, and do they do it in Sydney as well as Central Saanich and North Saanich?
So, yeah, to the mayor, of course, PMO is our tri-municipal emergency management organization, and Sydney specifically is responsible for emergency support services. We have a dedicated space on our 2nd floor mezzanine specific for ESS. They have their own little office, which they do great work out of. So we don't have a particular use for that space, but if we did, we're starting a recruitment drive for ESS, as well as communications, neighborhood emergency preparedness, and search and rescue volunteers. Those are the 4 components of PMO. And we would potentially hold an information session for potential volunteers. And again, those are things that we can do at the Sydney Street Market, or with sufficient time, we could do at other public events, whether it be at the Mary Winspear Center or putting something up at Town Hall. But again, this would allow for kind of a more permanent space to do that. So again, right now, it's not essential, but in the future, it likely will be as the town grows.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to the chief. In my recollection, after we went through a tour of the building, it's seismically upgraded. So this enclosed space would be as well?
Through the mayor to Councillor Garnett, again, I'm not an architect, but yes, the entire footprint of the CSB sits on seismically resilient piles driven into the bedrock. So yes, it would be.
So my follow-up question, if I may, in the event of a seismic event in Sydney, would there be the ability to accommodate, say, residents from the Orchard neighborhood in the space if they needed to?
Are you saying about overnight, like a group lodging type, sheltering type scenario?
Just for whatever amount of time it might be necessary.
Well, again, under that context, we would do everything we could, and it would be situationally dependent. But again, I believe one of the other councillors referred to our pending disaster water provision plan, and that would be a place where we could happily have a what we call a pod, or a C pod, or community point of distribution, where people would be able to come and access clean potable drinking water. That would be kind of potentially an anchor spot for that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Keith. Councillor Keith, sorry.
Thank you. Just a couple other things I wanted to mention is that, don't disagree that this might be nice to have, but the way I look at this is in terms of the other things that I think are most important. We haven't allocated anything a whole lot in the budget for maybe additional affordable housing projects. There's also very little space elsewhere in the budget where we could make an impact on taxes. As mentioned, this could be up to 1.5% tax reduction. And I don't know where else we're going to get those sort of reductions. And Councillor Kennard, sorry, you look puzzled. And I know it's not tax funded, but what I would propose if we were to take this off the books is that there's potential to, it frees up a significant amount of money from the Growing Communities Fund, which we could then move other reserve funded projects out of that, and then reduce our contribution to reserves, which would result in at least, I think, a 1.5% increase. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll support the motion on the floor. We appreciate how important our fire and emergency services are in the community, and Council's been very supportive during the time I've been serving each year, in particular to maintaining and improving the service with additions to staff, whether it be the overnight service, whether it be additional personnel, and this year with the second deputy chief. Those things are essential in our community, and has been indicated that this is not essential at this time, and it doesn't afford an opportunity, a small opportunity, to have to reduce the tax impact, which is quite significant in very challenging times. I'll leave my remarks there. Councillor Gurnett?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to confirm with, through you to staff, with Mr. Hissick, discussion about the Growing Communities Fund and that portion of this could be used for other ways to cut the taxes. As my recollection is that there's only a certain amount of things that actually qualify to be used for the Growing Communities Fund. So I would like staff's input in terms of, do they see areas that we can mitigate the tax impact that actually would be eligible?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Garnett. I did take a quick look at our capital budget as a result of this having come up in discussion. And you are right, the GCF funding can only be used for growth-related infrastructure. There are no currently tax-funded projects that it could be applied to. However, I found one that is currently funded from the General Capital Reserve, that being the Beacon West Road improvements, $100,000. So if we redirected GCF to that, then we could use those funds which are only internally restricted and perhaps allocate that to tax-funded capital. So it could lead to a net reduction of $100,000.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Without doing a whole bunch more digging, I'm hard-pressed to find anything
Great.
more.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. Staying on that vein, I was wondering, also thought the library
Sorry,
path.
Councillor, I don't think
Okay.
that's appropriate at this
Okay.
time. Yeah. So we're staying with the motion. We appreciate the clarifications based on some of the motivation Councillor O'Keefe had, in particular Councillor Gurnett. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I don't think I had a chance to motivate when I asked my question, but the bottom line to my question was I think this is something that we're going to need, and Chief did say that we would end up doing this eventually because it is part of the plan, and if we don't do it now, as he suggested, it might end up costing $400,000 or $500,000. Regardless, it would probably end up being a similar percentage of the tax base, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm opposed to kicking things down the road simply because it's expedient and we can show a reduction in the tax. I think it's a false economy. I think if it's something that is part of the plan, it's something that is going to be built eventually, we should do it when it's in the plan and bite the bullet, get it done, get it out of the way, rather than keep having it as a sort of Damocles over our head because it's now $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 that we're going to have to address at some point in the future. So for those reasons, I'm opposed to taking this out of the budget.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Duck?
Yeah, I think it's worth putting down because as the chief has identified, it's not needed right now. The infrastructure's in place. It can be built at a future time. I don't think the building costs will increase dramatically at all because the infrastructure's already there. It's essentially putting up completing the shell, if you want to be. You're looking at a room that's a little smaller than this, and I think given that it's already built into the larger building and all the, as the chief has indicated, all the necessary preliminary stuff is done and the 34,000 spent, it will most likely maintain its expense relative to the growth of the population, which is when the chief has indicated it'll become more necessary, is when the population is increased. That'll be also an increase to our tax base, and so I don't think this cost will increase as has been indicated. And I think it's worth giving consideration to now because this is when we can transfer those funds, as staff have indicated, to other uses which are more imminent and challenging to this tax time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. I haven't really motivated to just ask questions, but I just want to say that I won't support the motion, and it's based on the fact that we had a discussion about $25,000 for All Bay that we thought would be wasted because we'd come back to where we were. And as the chief has just mentioned, we've spent $35,000 on this. So if we're not willing to walk away from 25, I don't know why we'd be able to walk away from 35. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I have a new point I wish to make, and that is I did note the Peninsula Emergency Measures Organization. It's a peninsula-wide organization, and it's quite remarkable. It has a long history in Sydney, and we appreciate what the Sydney Fire Department does in its support, physically and otherwise for that organization. And there have been volunteers in the past in that organization who have been champions of various parts of emergency management preparedness. Thinking of Earthquake Erica, who some of you may remember, and that perhaps there is an opportunity as our community continues to grow, but as other communities on the peninsula grow, that through the Peninsula Measures Organization and the other municipalities, that we could actually collaborate on a facility of this nature for the benefit of our residents. I'm not suggesting a particular proposal or anything specific, not looking for particularly for a staff response to it, but given that there would be consideration of this at some point in the future, particularly as the community grows, so I'll leave my comments there. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question on removal. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novick, Councillor Rentu, and Councillor Garnett. The motion carries. Thank you. Are there any other non-tax funded capital projects that colleagues would want to bring forward at this time? Councillor O'Keefe.
I'm not sure if this is the time to talk about, now that we've freed up some money in the Growing Communities Fund, how we might rejig a few things. In, like, for example, Mr. Hissick indicated one project that is currently being funded by, I believe, the General Capital Reserve Fund.
So just to interject for a moment, Councillor.
Sure.
That would be taking us to page 76. Thank you.
Okay. Yes,
in the
page
binder?
76.
Where we have a list of the General Capital Reserve funded projects.
Right. And so what, where I'm going with this is if there are projects here, the capital reserve, that we can fund through the Growing Communities Fund, and then that would allow us to reduce our contribution to the General Capital Reserve for the year. So I believe this year, as noted on bottom of page 76, that we're budgeted to transfer $150,000 into the General Capital Reserve for this year. So what I was proposing is looking for 150 things $50,000 worth of things, projects, that we could move from the general capital reserve and have that funded out of the Growing Communities Fund, because then that would have a tax impact, I believe.
Yes, it wouldn't change the ending balance of the reserve for the year. It would reduce the, what is being spent and what is and the contributions, which are tax funded.
Right.
So do you wish to make a motion, Councillor, with regards to the project you're referring to?
Sure, well, I'll start with the, I think staff mentioned the Beacon West road improvements would be something that we could fund from the Growing Communities Fund. So I will make that motion, that we fund the Beacon West road improvements of $100,000 from the Growing Communities Fund.
Second?
We have it moved and seconded. Any further?
No, I just, yeah, it's an opportunity again for us to reduce the tax implication. The next step would be, if we do this, then there would be a motion to reduce our reserve contribution would be the next step in the process. Thanks.
I'm turning to the movers, not seeing, Councillor Duff?
Yeah, just through you to staff, just to give some indication, because it was in a preamble that staff gave us that this would be one spot. Does this make sense? Because again, I don't want to be rejigging something that we should get direction from staff as to what's the best application of these funds, if that makes sense.
Mr. Essick?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I mentioned earlier, I looked through this list, and the only one I think that would be eligible for GCF is that $100,000 project. So if we were to change the funding on this, there are two options for reducing the tax impact. One is to take the freed up general capital reserve money and allocate it to tax-funded capital. The other is to leave tax-funded capital alone and reduce this year's reserve transfer by $100,000. So they both accomplish the same thing. I would say the latter is probably a little more efficient.
Thank you. Councillor Duck, you had the floor?
No, thank you. That helps. Thank you.
Councillor Rintoul?
Sorry, slow down for me. So, because it just feels like a shell game. I feel like we're on the Price is Right here right now. I want to make sure what you've said there indicates that this is going to illustrate into reduced taxes. This is going to have us our increase less this year, and I've heard throughout this process that our reserves need to be topped up. We can use them this year and next year. We have to be careful with them, but this seems like we're paying, we're moving from one fund to pay from a reserve, and perhaps not topping up that reserve in the manner in which I think staff were most comfortable with when this process was first explained to us. So one more time, a little slower.
Okay. Would I prefer not to reduce our reserve contribution this year? Yes, I would. Because if you look at the third year balance in the general capital fund, we're in the red if we fund everything that we intend to out of that source. But if council is intent on reducing the tax impact further, that's one way to do it. My recommendation would be to keep the reserve contribution as is, but it's ultimately council's choice. And if you kept the reserve contribution as is, there would be no reduction of the tax impact for this year. It's just we've saved $100,000 in this one reserve by funding it from another source.
Councillor Rintoul, you had the floor? Or I'll turn to Mr. Edwards.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And further to our CFO's comments, I did want to just remind council too that while it is good to make an effort to reduce the tax impact of this year, any reduction of the tax increase this year necessitates an increase in next year. So they're essentially, to put that in simpler terms, if this year we're looking at a 12% increase, for example, and next year was perhaps a 6% increase, if we reduce it from 12 to 10, we're now starting at next year at a lower baseline of our starting place for tax, and so that 6% necessarily will rise, unless there's further reductions in the out years. So that's just one general comment I wanted to make, and when we're thinking about tax reductions, but that doesn't mean that it isn't important to try to reduce the impact on this current year, which is what we're mostly faced with. Looking at this list of the general capital reserve funds, this is one way of reducing that impact, and it is a legitimate way to do that, and to use this Growing Communities Fund to pay for this particular project. It may also be eligible for the Fifth Street bus stop improvements. There may be an argument to be made that also is a growth-related project, and so there may be an opportunity to offset that impact as well. So a total of $135,000 from this project list.
You had the floor, Councillor. Councillor O'Keefe?
So just a question through you to staff, just on the previous comment about, if we took some of these actions to reduce, it's just going to increase next year. However, my understanding of what we're proposing is that now that we have freed up $300,000 in the Growing Communities Fund, so we have some latitude at, well, it's 240. Yeah, 240. So now that we have that money available, we're not deferring any projects to next year. We're just tapping into that Growing Communities Fund to pay it. So it's not like we're kicking those items down the road to next year, and that there would be an increase. Am I understanding that correctly?
Councillor O'Keefe,
Yeah.
if I might interject, and I think it would be helpful to illustrate Mr. Edwards' point. Mr. Hissack, do you have a slide that shows the 5-year increases? Or we can, Councillor, you can turn to page. No, it's like page 8, I think. Page 8. Sorry, it's not page 8. Is it page 8? Yes, it is page 8. Yeah. So we see that at the bottom in yellow for 2025 is a 12.85% increase. And we see for 2026 that it's a 6.88% increase. The point I think that was being made, or should be made, is that if you reduce, for example, the 2025 tax increase from 12.85% to 10%, just as an example, then you don't have the same base going into 2026. And so what happens is you're not adding 2.85%, but you're adding an amount close to that as a starting point for 2026.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll turn to Mr. Hissack.
Mr. Mayor, if I could add on in response to Councillor O'Keefe. Yes, freeing up that Growing Communities Fund amount will potentially enable us to come forward next year and find alternate funding sources for what's currently in the budget, or what might come up between now and then. It's just nothing in the 2025 plan beyond the 2 that have been identified qualify for this year, but given time, we might be able to come up with a use for that next year and reduce our starting point accordingly. Whether it'll be 1-to-1, it's hard to say at this point, but all comments are true.
So, Mr. Rintoul, or Councillor Rintoul, you did have the floor in asking Mr. Hissack to go. No. Sorry, it had moved on to Councillor O'Keefe. Your, Councillor Duck, please.
Just to be clear again, the motion is to pay for the Beacon West Road improvements out of the Growing Communities Fund. We haven't given any direction in the motion to what would happen to that money there. So staff have given us direction as to we have to make a choice, which would follow up if we approve this motion. We have to then determine whether that's where that funding is going to stay. If it's going to stay in the reserves or to be taken as a tax reduction. And I think that's to be clear that right now we're only deciding on paying the Beacon West Road improvements out of the Growing Communities Fund. Then we'll have to make a decision of how that fund saving is being used. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff. If I could just have the original motion read back, please, if it's possible. Yeah, please. Thank you.
That the Beacon West Road improvements in the amount of $100,000 be funded from the Growing Communities Fund.
Okay. And if I may, and so further to Councillor Duck's position, I think the only way we're actually seeing a tax reduction is if we were to lower that amount contributed to the reserve, the General Capital Reserve Fund. Just by funding it out of the Growing Communities Fund does not reduce taxes.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so seeing no further discussion, I'll now call the question. All those in favor? That carries unanimous. Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe.
I'll, sticking with the similar theme, taking staff's suggestion in terms of the 5th Street bus stop improvements, and propose that those improvements of $35,000 also be funded through the Growing Communities Fund.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. Discussion? I think we're in the
I
same.
think we've kind of covered it.
I think we have the same
And
motivations around the
Same
table.
motivation.
We
that-
may have questions, so I'll turn to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. No, I'll support this one as I did the previous one within the context that we're not reducing the reserve contribution. So thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. I do have, Councillor Keefe, please go ahead.
If now's the time to, so I would move that we reduce the reserve contributions to the General Capital Reserve by $135,000.
Do we have a seconder?
Second for discussion.
Councillor Keefe?
Sure, so, doing this will have no significant impact on the reserves. If you look at what we were proposing to put into reserves, it was 150. So what we're doing is we're pulling out $135,000 worth of projects, from this, so that it really doesn't have an impact on the bottom line, for the reserve fund. And that's what allows us to reduce the tax impact. Thank you.
Councillor. Councillor Duck? Sorry? I'll turn to the second.
No, thank you. Just for discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. Through to staff, if I may. So the intent of this would be reduce the contributions, but in an earlier communication, staff indicated that our reserves are in jeopardy, I guess is a good word. I'm just wondering if this motion supports or defeats that jeopardy.
Neutral.
Thank you, Councillor. I would prefer the term "in need of care," but in jeopardy kind of conveys the same message. Going back to when this reserve was initially set up over 10 years ago, the original intent was to begin accumulating some funds for long-term capital needs that we were not at that time funding out of reserve. Things like potential building replacements down the road. The way it's actually worked in practice is we've essentially replaced our tax funding of capital by funding and draining this reserve every year. So it's essentially an extension of that practice. So what we're really doing here is paying as we go. We're not building anything up, and that might be okay. What it just means is that there'll be one less source in future for things like building replacement. And frankly, unless we bump up our annual contributions significantly, it's not going to really serve that purpose anyway. So if we're resigned to borrowing for building replacement as we have been, then it's probably okay to just keep paying as we go on this one. I'm more concerned about some of our larger reserves like infrastructure replacement. Those are the ones that keep me up at night, not the general capital reserve. But it is good to look at all of our future funding sources in that way.
Thank you. So this essentially is a 1% decrease in tax, but from what I'm hearing is not is okay relative to the general capital fund going forward. That because earlier staff indicated that okay, if we don't do it this year, then maybe next year we have to put money into those into that fund and have those funds available. So I'm just trying to get clarity of if it's worth taking it this year for a 1% tax decrease or holding it in for future.
If it is reduced this year, then it will have a 1-to-1 impact on next year's tax increase because we have to reinstate that 135 that was cut. So you're reducing it this year to reduce this year's impact, but you're going to have to pay for it down the road.
Thank you. That's what I understood from other staff. So that's all. I will not support this motion. Thank you.
Councillor Gannett?
Thank you, Mayor. Likewise, I won't support the motion. It does have an impact on bottom line, and it has an impact if you look at 27, 28, and 29. Having an extra $135,000 may not seem like a lot right now, but for a future council, which we may or may not be on, it takes away some latitude for them to be able to make decisions. And I would like to be a generous councillor today for a future council of tomorrow to give them that opportunity. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Hissick did indicate at the very beginning of his presentation that if he had his druthers, he'd rather keep that 150,000 transferred to the reserve. I think he kind of walked around the decision in a couple of ways. Yes, it would work, but you know, there's always a consequence for decisions that you make, and the consequence is that, again, we're pushing it down the road, and next year we'll have to pay the price. So for that reason, I won't support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'm in support of the motion, and while Councillor Keefe addressed it, I want to be quite specific in the general capital reserve. So we have a beginning. The only place in our budget materials that this is found is in the slides that were from Mr. Hissick's first budget presentation on February 24th. So the general capital fund has a beginning balance going into this year of $566,000, and the contributions that are budgeted that would be funded by taxes are $150,000. The planned use from that reserve is $612,000, and that leaves an ending balance at the end of this year of $103,000. So by the decisions of being made of moving to the of funding this project, what we're doing is the contribution from taxes that was going to be $150,000 would be reduced by $135,000, but also the use would be reduced by $135,000, and so the ending balance of $103,000 does not change. So while we can say, we have heard of concerns with regards to the reserve ending balances, maybe where the starting balances are, beginning balances are this year, but where the ending balances are at the end of this year. Through the motions that we've previously passed, we are not changing the end balance for 2020 at the end of this year of $103,000. What we are changing is, on this slide, is if we reduce that tax impact by 1%, roughly 1%, We are at a starting point because of the base, reduction in the base, at something approximating 7.88%. However, that doesn't take into account the other factors that will come into play for the 2026 budget. For example, we have major capital housing projects that we've approved, are yet to be completed, and they will increase our tax base. We heard from Mr. Hissick at the beginning of this year that going in from last year, we would have expected higher increases given the housing approvals that have been given and that sort of thing. So yes, while it does change the base for next year, or starting point in terms of what is in our 5-year plan, we will be going through this process next year. And when I see 12.85% versus 6.88%, while that is not a firm figure for 2026, I would prefer to see a balance for that. One of the pieces that we haven't had a lot of discussion on is what is the importance of reducing the tax from 12.85%. And I'm going to say that we're below 12.85%. Mr. Hissick, I'm not sure what that number is based on the resolutions passed at the last meeting and what we've passed to this point this evening.
Would you like a response?
If it's readily available, I appreciate you might not have your abacus rate.
I do have my abacus, and Ms. Chen gave me one. I should have brought it. I also got a crystal ball from Mr. Edwards that I should have brought. But prior to voting on this resolution, we are sitting at 11.69%.
Okay. So the importance of that percentage and going forward with that percentage. It is important for me and on behalf of the residents of Sydney to lower the tax impact where it's reasonable to do so. And I would like to see it below 10%. We are facing now, as a result of the U.S. President's actions, the greatest uncertainty in our economic future. And we don't know the extent of it. I can tell you, we already see through media reports, and I can tell you from experience in the business community, that businesses are already suffering. And when businesses do not have a profit, they do not have to pay provincial taxes and federal taxes, but they still need to, and it's reasonable that they have to pay their municipal taxes. But they're doing that when they're not profitable, or potentially when they're not profitable. And we have residents who are in grocery stores trying to make decisions and facing higher costs because they want to be part of Team Canada. So I believe it's incumbent on us. We're doing our due diligence. We have the support of staff for information that we seriously consider. And we don't know what that tax increase is going to be next year. We understand that reducing it by 1 or 2%, whatever that final outcome is, does set our base a little higher, but the base is still much lower than it is where we sit today. So I wanted to mention that at this time because I think it's an important factor in the discussions we've had to this point, but in the remaining discussions we have this evening. Thank you. Councillor Duck.
Thank you, Mayor. I thank you for that reminder because I did write down similar thoughts, and I appreciate you giving those forward because, housing costs, increased food bank use, tariffs, hints of a recession. This municipal tax increase is only one part of the overall property tax increase. And if we can do our due diligence, then we're just providing an opportunity for people to continue in this community many of them on fixed incomes. We have a significantly aging population, the second largest in Vancouver Island. And so any tax increase each year is new money they have to find. And so thank you, Mayor, for reminding me of that. And yes, I will be supporting this motion now.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Gannett.
Yeah, I'll just, for one last time, I'll just say, and I appreciate the comments made by the Mayor and Councillor Duck. Unfortunately, these tariffs aren't going to be a problem just for this year, and these costs are not going to be a problem for just this year. We have this gentleman for 4 years. This could change as I'm talking. That's how quickly things are changing. And so next year, 27, 28, these could all be even worse, hypothetically. So if we're deferring or moving things down the line to reduce taxes this year, and I understand that's a strong desire to do so, and I have that same strong desire. But again, we have reserves and surplus issues that'll need to be addressed. And if we increase taxes in future years, we lessen the ability to do that, or we have to do it because we're in a position where we have to do it, and the tax increases will even be greater than we're anticipating, on top of whatever else is going on in the world that we can't control, but will have an impact on our community and our costing. Thank you.
Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. While I do appreciate the comments that have come forward, I still don't support the motion. I think if we look at this chart on page 76, if we move the Beacon West improvements and the Fifth Street bus stop improvements to the Growing Communities Fund, yes, we'll reduce the 566,000 to 430 some odd thousand. And if we continue to maintain the budgeted transfer to reserve of 150, we'll end up with $238,000 as an ending balance in the reserve, which, as Mr. Hisik has stated, we sorely need. And we have to build those reserves back up at some point in the future. And if we do have that larger reserve going into 2026, we will have a little more wiggle room when we are in this position next year, and we have to make some critical decisions to keep the tax rate from jumping astronomically, as Councillor Garnett suggested, because of unpredictable actions by our neighbors to the south. So for those reasons, I'd still like to err on the side of caution and keep money in that reserve fund. I'm totally okay with using the Growing Communities Fund because that's money that's already there, and as long as these projects qualify for it, it makes perfect sense to do that. But I'm opposed to reducing the tax rate simply to make it look a little bit better this year. I understand that people are struggling, but it may end up being worse for them next year, and I'd rather see a little bit more of a cushion in that general reserve fund, which would happen if we simply maintained the budget transfers as are stated presently. So for those reasons, I'll continue to oppose the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. My comment is that the unpredictability is today. We don't know the unpredictability next year. We can say it's going to be better. We can say it's going to be worse. We don't know unless anyone has a better crystal ball than today. And I appreciate Mr. Hisik, probably does. So if there's no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novak is opposed. Councillor Garnett is opposed. Councillor Duncan is opposed. The motion carries. Councillor Keefe, you had the floor.
Sure. Thank you. I sticking with the theme of reserves. I wanted to take a look at the computer reserve, and
sorry, Councillor Keefe, I'm just going to pause for a moment, and since we were on the page, and I see the green page on most of our binders, still up on most of our binders, the General Capital Reserve funded projects. Council, we had discussion at last night's meeting with regards to the All Bay Road gravel shoulder, or All Bay Road file, if you will, and we do have in our budget $50,000. I think it was noted from what we have, the direction that we have requested council proceed, that $50,000 under that motion is likely no longer required, based on the costs that staff estimated for what could be the signage required, would be substantially less, perhaps below 20,000. And so I think consideration should be given to rescinding the motions which specifically refer to, in the budget, to the All Bay Road gravel shoulder, to rescinding those motions and to then passing a motion to put in what we might feel is a more appropriate amount for All Bay Road. Councillor Duck?
I'm prepared to make those motions. I don't have the motion numbers at hand, but they're specific to All Bay in terms of extending the gravel shoulder, and if our corporate officer could help me in the number of those ones they were in.
I'll turn to Mr. Edwards or Ms. Nelson for some guidance, or even Mr. Hissick. If we simply remove this item from the budget, does it not deal, in effect, we are rescinding those motions?
I think you have to rescind them.
I don't think it does necessarily remove or rescind the existing motions. The existing motions are still there, and staff would effectively say that they have been complete, or they would just remain hanging, so to speak. So the better process would be to rescind them, and we can pull up those motion numbers.
Thank you. We'll await that. Thank you. Councillor Rintoul?
Just while that process is moving forward, you made reference to the next step in this, potentially putting a figure in the budget for the motion that was approved last evening around no parking signs, and you gave reference to an approximate cost of $20,000. Could we just look to staff to verify that? I know there was maybe some darts thrown on the spot that evening. I don't know if anything's firmed up further since in terms of whether or not $20,000 would be a reasonable amount to put in the next phase of this discussion.
I'll turn to Ms. Clary. Thank you.
Through to Councillor Rintoul, we believe $20,000 would be sufficient for the requested action.
Ms. Nelson?
I've got them.
I've got the resolutions.
Yeah,
Did you want me to read them out?
I can read them.
Okay.
I move that we rescind Council's resolution number 2024.41.408 and number 2024.41.409. Those refer to the budget item brought forward by staff to widen the gravel shoulders on both sides of All Bay. And if that was to be approved, there would be the one section would have a no parking. So this is rescinding both these motions.
Second.
We haven't moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? That carries unanimous. Councillor Novik.
I'll move that we add a budget item in the amount of $20,000 to cover the cost of potential street signs on All Bay pursuant to the motion last evening.
I might suggest the wording be All Bay Road improvements.
All Bay Road improvements, fine.
Second.
Any discussion? Councillor Gurnett.
Yes, through you to staff, I appreciate that you mentioned that you figured $20,000 could cover the cost. Given the discussion we've had about tariffs, would that include a contingency for potential cost increase, or should we add an extra $5,000 to potentially cover any increased cost due to tariffs?
I would hope the signs could come from Canada.
Well, just in case.
Mr. Hissick.
Still have to be made.
Just while they're doing their research, unless this is going to lead to some further tax reduction, I would suggest leaving a bit of a contingency in. And whether it's 20 or 30, it doesn't really matter. We're just going to do what we need to do. So unless there's an intent to follow this up with a further reduction of general capital reserve contribution for the year, it's probably best to err on the side of caution.
You had the floor, Councillor Garnett.
Yeah, sorry, staff would like to.
Oh, Ms. Clary, please.
Through to Councillor Garnett, we're not aware of any impacts that the tariffs may have at this time on the actual purchase of the sign materials. The labor would be in-house, so that is a known cost, but there's a very real possibility that we may be impacted by tariffs on this one.
Thank you. I would prefer, as Councillor or Mr. Hissick has stated, I would prefer a bit of a contingency just to be on the safe side. I'm not sure what amount would be comfortable, but I would say 25,000 as opposed to 20
So I'll turn,
as an amendment.
yes, Councillor Garner, if you could frame that as an amendment?
I'll move an amendment that we add an additional $5,000 as
No, that
contingency.
the amount.
$25,000.
The amount of
Second.
25. Discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? That carries unanimous. So we now have the amended motion. I'll call the question. All in favor? And that carries unanimous. Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe?
Yeah, a question through you to staff. I'm just calculating the amount that we've now pulled out of the general capital reserve. And I think we were up to 135. I'm just wondering, is there another 10 or 15,000 there that we could also pull out from the reserve contribution for the coming year? I've just lost track of whether it's 15 or 10,000.
It's all right.
The reserve contribution is now down to 15,000, and it's council's prerogative whether you want to reduce that to zero. You can't go negative.
Yeah, right, yeah. I thought it was around 15, but I wasn't
Yeah.
sure.
Just before going there, Mr. Hissa, could you provide us a current number of where we're at with regards to the tax impact to this point?
We're sitting at 10.84 with, if you wanted to get under double digits, we need another 125, just so you know.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards?
Thank you, Mayor. In response to Councillor O'Keefe's question, there may be an additional project with the Frost and Lockside bus stop improvements, which could be attributed to the Growing Communities Fund.
Okay.
Sorry, Councillor O'Keefe. Councillor O'Keefe, you had the floor.
Thank you. So I'll move that we fund the Frost and Lockside bus stop improvements of 15,000 from the Growing Communities Fund.
Second.
Same motivation as before, pulling it out of here, funding it from Growing Communities Fund, and then the next motion would be to reduce our contribution to the capital reserve for this year by an additional 15,000.
Okay, so before I go to before I go to a seconder, we have removed $25,000 from the general capital reserve by reducing the All Bay from 50,000 to 25,000. We can take a portion of that 25,000 and reduce the general capital reserve by contribution by 15,000, which is what you're considering doing after removing this $15,000 Frost and Lockside bus stop.
I'm flexible either way. I was just taking staff suggestion. It just seemed to be the easier route to go, but if it's easier to take it the other way, that doesn't matter to me. I'm just trying to do whatever staff thought was most expeditious.
It's just more resolutions, that's all. Same difference.
Okay.
The floor is yours. If you wish to proceed, we have, with that motion, I'll look for a seconder.
I seconded it.
Oh, you did second it? My apologies. Please continue.
Yeah, so I'm just taking staff's lead on that that's it's a reasonable approach, and then it sounds like the net result would be the same. Whether it's we take it from the All Bay or this.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe?
And I will move that we take an additional 15,000, or we reduce our contribution by 15,000 to the general capital reserve for 2025.
Second.
Second. Any discussion?
Same as before.
Councillor Novak?
As before, I oppose removing money from the general reserve fund, simply to reduce the taxes.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duncan, Councillor Gannett, Councillor Novak are opposed. The motion carries. So as we understand, Mr. Hissick, the general capital reserve fund has been amended that there will be a zero contribution for 2025. We've reduced the use from the 2025 by 150,000, and so the ending balance will remain at 103,000. That's the landing point after these motions.
Sorry. With the additional, we did vote on reducing the All Bay amount, right? So our ending balance will be a little bit higher because of that. So we're looking at an ending balance of 114.
Sorry, if we reduced All Bay by 25, it would go from 103 to 128?
No, the three other projects that were alternatively funded from GCF totally offset the 150,000 contribution cut. So the net difference in the ending balance is the change to the All Bay project. So our ending balance will now be 114,361.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that is, I think, address those items in the general capital reserve funded projects. Councillor O'Keefe, you wanted to turn to a different item within the budget.
Thank you. I wanted to take a look at the computer replacement reserve. And I guess I'll just make a motion then. That I propose that we reduce the contribution to computer reserves by 50% only for the year 2025. That would be the contribution for this year is slated to be 110, so we would reduce it to what is proposed is to reduce it to 55,000.
Second for discussion, what page reference is that in the binder?
Okay, so if you look, this chart is my chart, but if you look at page 102 is where the contributions are listed. And then expenditures are listed on page 82. So all that I attempted to do to make it easier was to
102 is not.
to put them.
So 102, it takes us to a capital budget page.
Oh, sorry, that was 20. I think it's 205, actually. Sorry. So it's pages 82 and 205, and I just tried to put it on in one place. And so, and I did touch base with staff, and I know they had some concerns. Part of it might have been because I think they thought that I was proposing to cut the contributions by 50% for each year, and that's not the case. It was just for this year. And the rationale for that is when I looked at the balance that we currently have, and then looked at the contributions that we're planning to make over the next 5 years, and the expenditures that staff have indicated, there's still a fairly healthy balance of almost 300,000 left at the end of 3 years. And so I thought cutting the reserve contribution, again, that's at 55 thousand just for this year only, would be maybe about a 1/3% in taxes. And based on what staff have projected for expenditures over the next 5 years, it didn't appear that it would impact us significantly. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Councillor O'Toole?
Yeah, no, I won't motivate. I'll just turn to staff to get their comments on what's been suggested. Thank you. Through the chair to staff.
Mr. Hisik or other staff?
Thank you. I would be strongly opposed to this reduction. We need to take a longer than a 1-year look at it, and even longer than the 5-year span of this particular budget. Those contributions were reduced a few years ago to remove the software replacement component, and in recent years, and I think I've answered this question offline to various budget questions. In recent years, we've determined that we really do need to think about enterprise software replacement. So if you'll notice that a reserve contribution that's been fairly stable for a number of years is now gradually increasing a little bit because it needs to. The only way I'd be comfortable with this one-time reduction is if we committed to replacing that lost funding over the next 4 years. Otherwise, I would strongly advise against it.
Councillor O'Toole, you had the floor.
No, thank you.
I'll turn, for a first time, I'll turn to Councillor Novick, then Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't support this motion. I think there's a reason that staff built this program of computer equipment replacement, software replacement. I think it goes beyond our level of competence to second guess them on whether or not it's appropriate to have those levels of funding for future equipment replacement. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Hisik, for that answer, that Councillor Rizzo's question. I won't support the motion either, and I was looking back to the February 24th staff report, page 12, under reserve funding, paragraph 3, where staff mentions contributions to some of our reserves, such as those for vehicle or computer replacement, have not seen an increase in many years. And of course, the prices have increased. So I think this is very prudent on staff's part, particularly as we move through into our next 5 years and knowing how much more dependent town resources will be on computers and the requisite equipment and software they need to be with it. And again, you know, having some impact for contingencies for price overruns, I think is, again, as I said, is prudent. So I thank staff for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. So I'll turn to Mr. Edwards, please.
Thank you, Mayor, and I just wanted to echo our CFO's comments too. And the technology that Sydney uses is antiquated isn't quite the right term. It's not quite antiquated, but it is not at the current standards that it should be. Coming from my previous places of employment, which were further ahead with the technology that they used, is something that I've noticed in my time here, that there is a greater challenge in achieving some of the work efficiencies that we should be achieving, and the attention to modernizing our computer systems through this program will help us get there.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Councillor Keefe.
Thank you. Question through you to staff. I think it was mentioned that we haven't had a good look at the computer replacement reserve policy since 2009, and also that you're anticipating, I hear that things are getting more expensive, so do you anticipate revising your proposed expenditures then over the next 5 years, and is that something that's in the planning stages?
Or the policy. Mr. Hisik?
I'm not sure how to answer that one. Each and every budget year we look at our replacement reserves in relation to our needs, and we make tweaks. Computer hasn't really received a lot of attention for a while, but we have been buttoning that up and tightening it up over the last few years, and we'll continue to get better. Does the policy itself need amendment? No, I think it's working. The thing to tweak is the annual contribution, which we can do through the budget process. I'm more concerned about the vehicle reserve than about this one. But again, it's not a policy issue, it's a budget issue, and it'll come forward through this process, I think, if that answers that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novick, Councillor O'Toole, myself, Councillor Gurnett, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Duck. Thank you. Mr. Hissick, could you give us an update? I think there was one more item after the last update we had on the tax increase.
We are at 10.67%.
Thank you. Council, do you have any other, Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. Just a question through you to staff. So going back to the CSB, part of the funding for that, there was some of it from the Growing Communities Fund, and I think there was another 54,000 that I think it was carried over from last year, or I'm not sure exactly where that resides. And so I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to use that 54K, since it's not gonna go into the CSB. Are there some tax-funded items? I presume you would like those to be with the fire department.
That's the wildfire money we'd previously discussed.
Right. And so since it's not, it was allocated for the CSB, we're not spending that now, how would that be spent?
We would likely leave it where it is until an appropriate project came forward, likely a
Okay, so there's-
capital project.
There's nothing within the existing operational budget where we could use those funds? So
We-
it'll just,
We would advise against using it for current operations. We would probably look to some kind of fire capital enhancement that wasn't just routine replacement of equipment. And there's not a lot of fire capital in the budget aside from vehicle replacements over the next 5 years.
okay. One other question, if I may. I was hoping that we could have something in the budget that would allow us to have a bit of something in there for affordable housing initiatives that may come forward later in the year after staff have had an opportunity to rejig that housing action plan that we had. And there was a few things in there. And I'm wondering whether we still have some room in the Growing Communities Fund, whether housing initiatives are something that we would be able to fund out of that. Say I'm not sure what those would be yet, because staff have yet to kind of fine tune what that plan might look like, but giving at least some funding there so things came forward.
Again, it's meant for infrastructure related to housing growth. I don't think any of those studies that were discussed last night would qualify. And I think I mentioned last night that we would report back on what was discussed and come up with non-tax funding sources for council to consider. And that can be done at the time the report's brought forward because it's non-tax, and that could be a budget amendment. We don't necessarily need to figure that out now.
Okay. And then I guess sticking with the Growing Communities Fund, there's still some space in there now that the CSB project is gone. Are there any other tax-funded projects or things that you see that we might be able to pay out of the Growing Communities Fund to help us reduce the tax impact?
Mr. Mayor, I think I've answered that. I think Mr. Edwards came up with two that I didn't immediately, but I think we're done there. And frankly, everything that was cut from the CSB project has now been allocated to other things, maybe a little remainder.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Mr. Edwards, please.
And thank you, Mayor. Just adding on to that comment, I would recommend retaining the remainder, which is approximately 70,000 for any future needs that might arise, either in this current year or to help offset impacts for next year.
Thank you. Councillor Keefe, you had the floor.
That's all for now, thanks.
Thank you. Council, we've been going through other capital, and I'll just ask one last time if there's any other items in the other capital that, non-tax funded, that council would wish to discuss. Not seeing any, I would turn back to Mr. Hissick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And honestly, there's a lot flying at me in one night here. I'm doing my best to keep up. If we find that we misspoke on anything, we'll certainly report back on it at a later time. I believe, are we satisfied we're done with capital?
Yes.
Okay. So moving on to the, well, if we wanted a motion to approve capital as amended at this time, that would be welcome, or we could do all those at the end. It's up to council's discretion.
Is there anything else? So we're looking now, pending any further discussion, to approve the operating budget as amended and to approve the capital budget as amended. What other motions would we require this evening, Mr. Hissick?
Just that, a motion to approve the general capital budget as amended and the general operating budget as amended.
And would we then need motions with regards to the sewer and water?
Those are coming up next, yes.
Okay, thank you. Is there, we can go ahead with the general operating as amended and the capital as amended if you wish now, and then we could move on to the sewer and water. Councillor Duck?
Yeah, I would move that we accept approve the general operating budget as amended.
Second.
We haven't moved in seconded. Any further motivation? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? That motion carries unanimous. Councillor Novak?
I'll move that we accept the capital budget, or approve the capital budget as amended.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? That motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Mr. Hissick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Seeing as we're happy with the general operating, I won't repeat what I've already said before about it. Moving on to the water utility. We have a few increases within that utility built into the budget. The ultimate impacts are an increase to the fixed charge on the quarterly utility bill to $24.50 per quarter from $20, and this is the first such increase since the new rate structure was implemented. Furthermore, there is the annual increase to the consumption charge, in which we're simply passing on the increase from CRD water for the bulk water rates. If council has any questions on the water operating or capital budget, I'd be pleased to address them.
Thank you. Are there any questions from colleagues? Seeing none?
A motion to approve the water utility budget as presented would be in order.
Councillor Novak?
I'll move to approve the water utility rates as presented.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? That carries unanimous. Thank you.
Finally, the last component of our budget, the sewer utility. We do have increases again because, as we've been talking about for a few years, this utility really needs some work in terms of the rate setting. And now that we are fully staffed up in finance, we intend to get to that by the end of this year. In the meantime, we're recommending an increase to the sewer user fee to $10.70 per 1,000 gallons, with the impact on the average account being $12 per quarter as a result of that, and that is the only increase. Are there any questions about the sewer operating or capital budgets?
Not seeing any from colleagues. It would be appropriate to have a motion at this time. Councillor Duck.
I move that we approve the increase for the sewer utilities as presented.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? That carries unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now that the budget itself is approved, I would just like to quickly spend a moment on our tax distribution policy. As has been mentioned in previous staff reports, we've been phasing this in over what was intended to be 10 years, but because of market movement, we are, as of this year, below our target. So the recommendation is to leave it below the target as opposed to capping the reduction at the 2-to-1 ratio. And that's how the tax rates would be brought to you. The impact of doing it that way is that the final tax impact will be evenly allocated to residential and commercial tax payers, as opposed to if it were capped at the 2.1 target ratio, we would see a larger increase for commercial and a slightly lower one for residential. So if council approves staff's recommendation to leave it where it falls naturally, then we will set our tax rates accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Councillor Duck.
If there's no questions, I'll make the motion that we leave the tax assessment as proposed by staff.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. Councillor O'Keefe.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question. So we've come down on our deliberations here for an increase that is 10 point something. How does that, in here it said the residential increase would be 11.46. So any idea of what that would look like with this tax distribution policy? Would it be?
We landed at 10.67 overall impact. So that would be the impact on both residential and commercial if this motion's approved.
Proportional reduction.
Okay, thank you.
Those differentials would only be in effect if we chose to cut off the reduction at the 2.1 target as opposed to letting it fall naturally below that, if that makes sense.
So the increase for residential and commercial would both be at the 10 points?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. If I may, to Councillor O'Keefe, were you searching for the number if we didn't approve what's on the floor? Like if we were to cap it at 2-to-1, I think it drops 1.39 on top of that based on the numbers. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do have the motion on the floor. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? And that does carry unanimous.
That essentially concludes our deliberations. Just a quick word on what follows. Water, sewer, and garbage rate bylaws will be brought forward for amendment next month, or actually next meeting, which I believe is on the 24th. The financial plan bylaw and the tax rates bylaw would follow a little bit later after the final assessment figures are out. So that would be in late April with adoption in early May. With that, I thank council and my colleagues very much for what's been a very thorough process, and we still have challenges ahead of us, but I think we took a big step forward tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick, for taking us through this tonight, and I will echo thanks to all staff involved in budget preparation, in supporting council's deliberations over 3 meetings, and thank you to my colleagues. I will now seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved and seconded, all in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you.